Like my noisiest fidget. Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. And I'm excited because today with me is Zoe. You can see her name there on the. Zoe Verdon is our new director of operations. She just joined Effective Artistry on the business and administrative end of things, which is brilliant for me because I am terrible at all that stuff and hate it. Really, we talk all the time about community and partnership and support and whatever. And this is the thing. I specialize in the content and the knowledge and being a therapist and a coach and Zoe specializes in making sure that the bills get paid and that, we have a decent strategy and plan so that, we can be a functioning business and do what we do. But it's exciting to have you here, Zoe, and for everybody who's here to get to see you. And it's exciting too because this is an opportunity for us to talk about the content stuff where a good amount. We've talked a lot, but there's a lot more that you might be curious in, and it's easier for me to answer questions than to just ramble.
Yeah, no, I love that, and thank you so much for having me. I am so thrilled to be part of this business, but I feel like this is an excellent forum for me to just get to know it so much better, because that's what you do in this hour. Great.
And that is what we're doing. It's just, for those of you watching, it's a conversation, and we'll start with what we start with because we like to start with something so there's not just quiet, intense staring at the screen. But if you're here watching, in particular, if you're here in the chat and you say something, what you say, we see it. Questions get answers and comments get responses, and that's how it works to be a person in conversation with other person. So whatever we're talking about doesn't matter. You want to say something about it, great. You want to talk about something completely different, let us know and we'll go wherever we go. Cool.
Great.
So let's start off. I am really hot. I don't know if you can see so I'm going to take off my cardigan. Informal, kind of very greaser look, the black t-shirt.
But yeah, greaser. Excellent. I feel like everybody can appreciate a greaser. I actually put this on thinking that it would be smart, and I might get overheated too and be back in the t-shirt soon anyway. So
I know. I actually considered pacing back and forth while we did this today because I don't know that I've ever talked about this on the stream, but I love pacing while talking. It's very helpful for me for a lot of reasons, but it's not very conducive to camera. So,
well, we should definitely arrange that though at some point, a way for you to a runway for you.
Like a GoPro that points at my face so I can walk around everywhere. And
yes, that sounds brilliant.
Go ahead.
Well, I did want to. I was kind of interested in just jumping in because one of the things that I think I am most interested in my position here is just how we talk about exactly what we do. And I should probably preface this since I'm live. My almost 1-year-old is probably eating blueberries right now, and he's very vocal when he eats blueberries. So they will be shifting into another room shortly. But if you're wondering what's happening in the background, there's just a deep enjoyment of blueberries.
I just have an image of him by himself eating blueberries over
there. Just in a pile of blueberries. Talking about being able to speak eloquently, not just about executive functioning, but about what it is that effective artistry does. How and how it's different than your typical executive functioning coaching, and how our therapists, the training that they receive, how that's different than going to a traditional therapist.
Yeah, let's talk about it. This is why it's good to have somebody more business-minded here, because I've been told over and over that I need to have elevator pitches and concise ways to explain it. I've come up with different ones, but concision is not my strength. And honestly, that's a lot of, I think, what the value of what we do is, that we embrace the complexity. We don't run from it. But that, I don't know, it's not a very good business strategy from what I understand.
Right.
Prompt me to talk about this. No, so therapy is therapy and coaching is coaching, and they're two different things. And I like to try and focus on what it is that we do, as opposed to in opposition or contrast to what other people do, because I don't know what every other person does, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is what we do. I mean, it matters what other people do. I mean, for purposes of people understanding what we do. So there are obviously similarities, and coaching as a whole, there's a lot of discourse around coaching right now because it's unregulated, unlike therapy, where there's licensure and specific training modalities and requirements and ethics boards and oversight, which is great. And it also has its problems, logistically speaking, for sure. Things like licensure is done state by state, as well as most like relevant therapy laws. So you can't work with a specialist who's not licensed in the state that you're in, even though we all do telehealth kind of stuff these days, whereas coaching has more flexibility. So for us, the differences kind of fall into two categories. One is the logistics of it, and that's less important, I think. Well, it's less interesting to me. Maybe it's as or even more important. But I'll focus in on like the work, the experience of what coaching and therapy are. And the only reason that we even consider these things to be somewhat similar, like generally, culturally, is because the format looks very similar. It's sitting down for an hour a week or so, 50 minutes a week, to talk with somebody about things that are causing you problems, and to explore those things with somebody else and come up with ideas and strategies and whatever to try and solve those things. But that could be said about a lot of different relationships. You know, if you have a good employer and employee relationship at your work, you probably sit down and have meetings with your boss or your colleagues where you sit down and talk through things together. Because the value of it, really more than anything else, comes from just the experience of two humans or more than two humans interacting with one another and communicating. See, I'm telling you, Zoe, concision, not my strong suit. I haven't even gotten to the answer yet. I'm just like setting the... I don't even know if concision's a word, actually. I should look that up. It might be conciseness.
I'm going to look that up while you're talking.
So for us, executive functioning coaching is easier to define because it's more limited in scope, and then build from there to talk about therapy. Executive functioning coaching is when you sit down and you work with your coach, who has a lot of information and expertise and experience on executive functioning and how the brain works and how we allocate resources and what those resources are, and et cetera, and talk through whatever things are causing issues for you and try to come up with new solutions that are worth trying. Specifically, it's a focus on practicality, on observation, on concreteness. My way of talking about it, that is still probably pretty academic, is that it's all deductive. Meaning, deductive is we start with something big and then break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. It's a form of reasoning and logic, right? Deductive versus inductive. Deductive, you're asking, okay, this big concept, if this were true, then what would we expect to see? You know, and so we start looking for those things. Inductive is the opposite. It means, okay, we're observing this thing. If we're observing this, what does that imply might be true? So executive functioning coaching is always going to be about getting more specific, more individualized, more concrete. If you sit down and say, hey, I overslept and missed my big job interview that I was super excited about this week, an executive functioning coach is not going to talk about, well, it sounds like you're self-sabotaging or you're afraid of success. An executive functioning coach, for us anyway, is going to talk about, okay, well, what happened? Did you set your alarm that you usually set? Did it go off? If so, blah, blah, blah. You know, what happened the night before, et cetera, et cetera. Because we are specifically in executive functioning coaching, we're not looking at intention. The executive functioning and consciousness are separate things, which I want to talk a lot about, but will probably just be more philosophical than anything else. That we're not looking at what it is you want or whether it's okay to want it or whatever. Executive functioning is what takes place between when you have an intention and what behavior ends up happening. All the stuff in between is executive functioning. So whatever your thoughts and intentions are, they're yours. And then when things don't line up with what you were wanting it to be, something went wrong with executive functioning, and that's where we're going to look. We're always looking for concrete, actionable strategies, intervention systems, whatever, to try every session. But that's the question, is what is worth trying, not what will work, because we don't know. Nobody does. We know what things might be more likely to work for certain kinds of people, and et cetera, et cetera. But the question is always what's worth trying. So at the end of every session, people walk away with, okay, between now and next time we see each other, you're going to blank, blank, blank. And from that point on, there is no failure. Either you do the thing and it helps you, which awesome, perfect. Or you do the thing and it doesn't help you, which great. Now we have more information. Or you don't do it at all, or you forget, or you don't want to, or whatever. All of those are just versions of it didn't work, which is all great, because you and your coach together wouldn't have come up with the idea if you knew that it wouldn't work. So that means that there's information involved in that you didn't have access to before, because it is a process of figuring it out. I will say, I don't want to generalize, but I do know of many other programs that are more like this. We don't have a curriculum. We have a very specific process. We don't have a curriculum. It's not a 12-week program where week 1, we're going to learn this way of using a to-do list. Week 2, we're going to learn this way of managing your calendar, right? We do those things when they come up, when they're relevant, when a client wants to be working on them, because it's individualized. The simplest answer that works is the best one. So if you're struggling to get something done and somebody says, probably the most common piece of advice in that situation, just make a list or break it up into small chunks. If that works for you, if for whatever reason that statement enables you to go and get it done, great. If it doesn't, then we want to get more complex. And for people for whom, the generic advice of make a list, for those people for whom that works, those aren't the people we see. Why would you spend your time and energy and money coming to find an executive functioning coach if the common and simple and well, you're not struggling with it? So we get more complicated and individualized from there.
And so obviously you're going down this path. You've started this company because you are having success with clients with what you're doing. Can you describe? Can you kind of quantify the success that you're seeing? I'm very curious about what you've observed.
That's probably a good thing to have a business-minded person on board for, to like quantify things in some kind of way like that, because I can talk about it, but I don't like track data per se. But yes, no, what we're looking at, I'm going to actually talk about what I talk to the coaches and therapists, the people that I train here, what I talk to them about as far as metrics, because metrics are great and useful, and like all constructs, limited, made up. We made them up to serve a purpose, and they serve that purpose. And then sometimes people try to use them for other purposes that seems like they should work for, but they don't. And I've talked about this particular phenomenon on the stream before, but I don't know if you and I have ever talked about it, Zoe. Sometimes it's called the Cobra effect. It is the idea that the moment that you select and identify a metric, it ceases to be a useful metric. Because the process of selecting a metric, what we're talking about is we have some goal, but that goal is difficult to quantify, difficult to measure. So instead of measuring progress toward the goal, we sub in a metric as a stand-in. I often will call them markers. So an example of this would be nobody cares about how much they weigh. Nobody cares about the number on the scale. They care about how they feel, or how they feel that they look, or how they feel that people perceive them. But those are difficult to track and difficult to quantify, especially things where you're going to put effort towards a strategy and not be able to observe whether it's having the impact you want it to have for some amount of time. We sub in these intervening things. But as soon as you select a metric, so theoretically here, actually, let's use a different one. Let's use grades. I like that one better. Nobody cares what grades are, except that they're theoretically indicative of learning or the ability to be successful, or however somebody might want to try to define like the goals of education. We don't really have any ability, especially when working with children, to talk about like, you got to learn this thing because 30 years from now, it might pay off for you. And it might not, but you got to learn it anyway.
Yes. Right.
And it's not about children being willful. It's about executive functioning. It's about the brain is a cognitive miser. It doesn't spend resources unless it has a reason to do so. So by telling somebody about a potential future problem, I give them a reason to pay attention to whatever I'm trying to teach them. But it's a pretty weak one, a pretty weak correlation. It's not going to be something that draws a lot of someone's attention. So we create this metric in between, grades, where there's an immediate feedback, and so that we can make changes as we go along. The problem is that as soon as you select a metric, you incentivize people to optimize for the metric. So when you select the metric, it's because you think there's an intrinsic connection between the metric, the marker, and the aim, what you're going for. That, oh, if people do well on tests, that would indicate that they're learning more. And that can make sense. But as soon as you identify it, now people are going to optimize for the metric, which means that that connection, that intrinsic connection, you broke it. Because now a test only represents their ability to do well on the test.
Yeah.
Just to solidify it, because I love metaphors and stories. The reason that it's sometimes called the Cobra effect is because a famous example of this is that the British colonial forces in India, a lot of their people were getting bitten by cobras and getting sick or incapacitated and dying. So they wanted that to happen less, right? The real aim is we want our soldiers, our people to get bitten by cobras less frequently. But how do we do that? We come up with strategies and metrics. And the thing that they eventually ended up implementing was a bounty system on cobras. They paid locals, they paid their people from India if they turned in dead cobras. Makes sense when you select it. If more people kill more cobras, if we incentivize that, then there will be fewer cobras, we'll get bitten less. Except that as soon as you make it a metric, people optimize. So what do you think happened?
They killed all the cobras?
Started breeding cobras. The easiest way to get is to make it easy to access cobra corpses. So they started breeding them. But it didn't actually help with the problem. And eventually, the British colonial forces realized what was going on, so they discontinued the bounty. Now there's a bunch of people with cobra farms full of now valueless cobras. So they just release them. And you end up with a lot more cobras.
Valueless cobras.
So
I'm sure they had value, Bridget.
Valueless to the individuals who were breeding them.
Okay.
Go ahead. No, please.
I feel like one of my goals needs to be to figure out how to ask you really hard questions that are hard for you to answer, because that seems to be challenging. You seem to have an answer for everything. So to go back to the grades, grades and testing, right? I mean, that's been contentious in our academic system for a long time. I'm sure, having 3 kids, that you have reimagined what the school system could look like. Sans grades and tests, what would it look like in an effective artistry world, in a Brandon Tesser's world?
I like that question. And just to be clear, there are many, many questions I don't have answers to. But one of the things that we talk about and that I find very valuable is to free people up from the idea of having to be correct about something. Because if someone asks me a question that I can't answer correctly, because most questions I can't. If someone, for example, says, is it a problem that my child blank, blank, blank? I don't know. But I'm not going to then say, and therefore I have nothing to offer you that may or may not be helpful. I'm going to say, I don't know. And here is what I can say that may be helpful to you in this process. Maybe not, but I'm trying to add stuff. Yeah, that's my dad. He shows up more weeks than not. Sorry, I lost track. Oh, what does it look like in an effective artistry world? So in this particular case, this is something I think about a lot because I do have 3 kids, and Susan, my wife, is a wonderful educator, and I'm a former educator and executive functioning, whatever. I think to have conversations like this, you want to split it into two buckets. One is, let's assume we were building something new, hypothetical, purely like burn it to the ground and start from scratch. What would we want it to look like? The other is, okay, that's all well and good, but here's what the reality is and what are practical things that we can do to try and move in that direction. Which one are you more interested in talking about first? We can talk about both.
I wouldn't be interested in talking about both, but I and I am a very practical person, so probably the latter is more practical, is more in line with what I would normally be asking, but I would be interested in burning it down and and the phoenix that would rise from the ashes.
I honestly think in like revolutionary circles or activist circles, when people will sometimes get in fights about like, no, any improvement to the system supports the existing system, we have to burn it all down. I totally understand that, but that's a theoretical framework, right? Like nobody's actually going to do that. So we want to think about it because that's how we design something that's ideal. In fact, we would call it first principles thinking in the cognitive science world. But there's value. You want to go back and forth between the two.
Yeah.
So in terms of what can be done right now, it is generally about getting rid of grades, minimizing the competitive aspect. It really all starts with higher education because that's where everything trickles down from. And even that really starts with occupational stuff. Because metrics, right? How does a high school, what metrics does a high school look at to justify its value is primarily based around college acceptance, both in terms of numbers and scholarships, but also what kinds of colleges and et cetera.
Yeah.
And then what is a middle school base? Its metrics around is how well prepared are those students for high school, and same back and back and back.
Yeah.
And so I think that the core thing is the competitive element, that even though, and most people don't know this, or at least don't think of it consciously, even though the vast majority, well, maybe not vast majority, but by far the majority of schools, colleges, in America are what are called open enrollment, which means it is not competitive. Just if you meet the qualifications, you get to go there. That's in large part because of community colleges, which are far more numerous than other kinds, and those are generally open enrollment. But for some reason, culturally, we look down on that. We value the competitive element because what we're doing is we're ranking people against each other, because what's the real point of education? And now I am getting a little more revolutionary, I suppose, but finish the statement. I got to get good grade. I got to work hard so I get good grades so I can go to a good school so I can
get a good job.
Yeah. Nobody answers that differently. Yep. And it's not to say that there's not other value in going to college. Of course there is. There's value in anything you do, of course. But yeah, you meet new people and you learn new things and all those things are true. But none of those things are the stated purpose. In other words, if all the graduates from that university said, oh, I learned a ton and I met new people and I broadened my horizons, but none of them got jobs, everyone would consider that to be a failed university.
Yes.
And because that's the value, it must be competitive. Because the value theoretically in having a degree in terms of employment is that it makes you a better candidate than somebody who does not have a degree. It has to be comparative. If theoretically 100% of people had bachelor's degrees, they would hold very little value in terms of employment.
Yeah.
I won't say none, because it still might say, oh, you studied what we do and that makes you better suited for what we're going for. But anybody who studied that would have a similar kind of a thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So this all trickles back to grading. The primary problem with grading is that we associate the grade with the student as opposed to with the process or the institution.
Mm-hmm.
If a student gets an F, we view that as a reflection on the student's fitness or capability or whatever. If a student gets an A, we view that as a reflection on the student, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, I can see that.
Why are we saying, here, adult, you're in charge of educating 27-year-olds? And yes, grades are underplayed. They're not as emphasized in the elementary level, generally speaking, as they are at higher levels, but they're still done, right? And it is still viewed as a reflection on the student, as opposed to, if we were going to be grading, theoretically, the value of that is in saying, is this serving the students? That if a student gets an F, that should be reviewed as that should be viewed as reflective of the education, the teacher, the system, the classroom. Not even the teacher; that's too individual. But that
Yeah.
we are failing this student instead of the student is failing us. But we can't do it that way because colleges need to be able to use grades to rank kids against one another. So we're instilling them literally from day one. Here are all your peers. Have fun and play and have friends, make friends and whatever, but don't forget you're competing with them. You are supposed to be smarter than the others. That's your goal.
And so, okay, in burning this system down, how do you remove competitiveness?
That involves burning down a lot more systems than just education,
Yeah,
because
that makes sense.
our whole culture is based on.
Yeah.
And see, Zoe, we start with a practical question, and I draw us into like real deep philosophy about restructuring our entire culture within 20 minutes.
Okay, so say it's culture based. Have you come across a culture that is not competitive? Have you read about experienced cultures that are not innately competitive?
Not with a lot of depth, so I don't want to like speak out of my field and say
Yeah.
definitively,
Mhm.
but generally competition is a hallmark of
Capitalism.
all colonialism, capitalism, Western, white supremacy, whatever. It's something inherent to scale, and particularly hierarchical scale.
Uh-huh.
So a way to explore this is to, create mental models and theoretical, let's look at, if we accept the premise, for example, that humans evolved and that process is what science tells us that it most likely is. That means that this one really is, orders of magnitude, the majority of the history of humanity, what we evolved for, the environment in which we evolved, was meant to be. I think you and I started talking about this the other week, actually, Dunbar's number, that there is theoretically, and we have evidence to support it, that humans mostly survived in environments in which they were grouped together in community with approximately 40 other people or so. And that over the course of your entire life, and the number, different people have different ideas about exactly what the number is, but a small group of people, right? So in that environment, competition doesn't make sense, which is why humans are not naturally competitive. What's your default response when you see another human being experience pain? You flinch when you see people get hit.
Yeah.
You cringe when you see people embarrass themselves. We are wired that way. We're evolved that way. See, I want to talk more about this, but it really goes into some very like philosophical stuff. I don't know if that's okay, or if you want to.
I really I think we should plan a future stream soon.
About competitiveness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, suffice to say, humans are not competitive by nature. It hurts to hurt another person. In order to get people to be willing and able to do that, you have to train them a lot. And if you look at it through that lens, you see it everywhere. You see how
Yeah.
kids.
I mean, I think it was in college that I recognized how, like, the beginning of my competitiveness, and the amount of anxiety, like, underlying anxiety since elementary school. And I was just, with my brother, and it wasn't, you know, it wasn't either of my parents saying, um, "You need to, you need to try to live up to what your brother's accomplished," but it was just general. praise for what he was doing and his brightness, right? His and well, intelligence. That's like 20 other streams, but
Yeah.
but yeah, it starts so young, and parents can't be aware of that, aware of
Oh,
how
sure.
they're reading that.
Plus, they were raised in the same culture. So
Exactly.
competition is something that they probably value as well. Even if it's not in a defeat the other person way, it's still in a be the best way. Even when you go to the doctor, if people who don't have kids might not know this, when you, at least here anyway, when you take your baby to the doctor, they weigh the baby, they measure how tall they are, and then they tell
Ugh,
you where they rank in
hate that.
percentile
I
among,
hate it.
which, what's the point? Aside from the fact that that information isn't generally useful to anyone, how does one baby compare to another, except in rare circumstances, it certainly is not valuable to the parents to tell them how their baby. I have heard so many people, myself included, I'm not exempt from this, who will say things like, yep, he's in the 90th percentile for height and whatever. I've never once in my life heard somebody say, yep, they're in the 33rd percentile for height. If it's particularly low, they might work on it. But if it's in relatively average, it's just not notable.
Mm-hmm.
And my personal, maybe this isn't well suited for a stream today, but have been developing a theory. I say developing a theory, it just means thinking about it. I've been thinking about it.
Right.
that this is specifically coded into the English language, and not that it's not coded into others. I just don't know others well enough.
Yeah.
But
We were talking about this the other day.
we were okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's cause and effect or that either or whatever, but it does all come back to executive functioning as well. That we have finite resources. You can only notice so much. So your brain has to make determinations without conscious input on what things are worth noticing.
Mm.
And anything that you perceive to be normal, another word that we would say for that is unremarkable, tends to not get noticed.
Mm-hmm.
So people notice how tall I am because I am unusually tall. I'm 6'5". People don't tend to notice the specific color of the brown of my hair because it's not that unusual. So we make decisions in large part based on what things stand out as being different from the norm. And that's not a bad thing. That's wired into us. The bad part is when we start to create value as though being different from the norm in one direction is good, but being different from the norm in the other direction is bad. Great to be tall, terrible to be short.
Right.
Not true in reality. I don't want to speak for you, Zoe, but I know you're not the tallest.
5'2". I'm now taller than my mother.
Do you have a terrible life because of your short? If only you were taller, it would be better.
No, I've always actually really appreciated being short. There have definitely been instances, but
Yeah, because
I
it's
like being
situationally advantageous and
exactly.
just like me.
I play a killer game of hide and seek. I can crawl into some small spaces.
Very niche application, but yeah, I'm terrible at hiding.
I have a 1-year-old. I think this is going to be very important for me.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, right? Is because of something like that, and we're joking around here, but because of something like that, you're more likely to play hide and seek because you're better suited for it. And I'm
Definitely.
not going to play it as much. Is playing hide and seek a good thing or a bad thing? Neither. But it's about fitness. It's about suiting the thing to the thing, not what's good and what's bad, which is the big problem with grading. So back to that question, and I know there were 2 other questions before that one that we didn't resolve. This is part of what happens in my coaching and therapy. I don't talk this much, but I got to track all the things. So
Absolutely. Well, and I still want to get back to the practical, what practically, if we're not burning the school system down.
Yeah, so practically, there are some really great thinkers out there on education.
Mm-hmm.
And I defer to them because they study this stuff more than I do. I have my own ideas about things. I am guessing, and I'm happy to share those, it's not like a secret. I'm guessing that most of the ideas that I have had have already, other people who study it more in depth are already exploring those things, but I'll contribute where I can. But for one, it's eliminating the value, meaning higher grades are good, lower grades are bad. Instead, if we use a system, a metric that doesn't value one outcome over another, but uses the information from the metric in order to determine what to do next. Not as in you need extra support to catch up because you're behind, but as in, oh, you enjoy and are well suited to this task, let's do more there. This task you don't enjoy or aren't as well suited to, but we collectively deem it to be an important one, so let's do more there too. This one you're not so suited to and don't enjoy, but we collectively don't think it really matters that much, so you can do it if you want, but we're not going to force you into it, kind of a thing.
That's interesting because I know in the UK, and I'm gonna totally not quote, but I'm gonna misdescribe this, but very early on, I believe that students are kind of siphoned into these more career oriented schools. A lot of the places. Yeah, I shouldn't be talking about what I don't know, but
Well,
I should know more. My
a
nephews
lot
are there.
of do that earlier specialization,
Yeah,
which can be good and can be bad too. Just
right.
a label, it can be helpful to be able to think of yourself in a certain way or other people to perceive you in a way. Situationally advantageous or disadvantageous. What if kids feel like they're getting locked in, for example, and don't feel free to explore other things?
Right.
And you got to look at who is the system built to serve. And something like education at that scale, it's built to serve the society, not the individual. And again, that's okay. It's not what we would, ideally want it to be, but there's not really a way to create something that's supposed to interact with every single human being in the system of a certain age and value each individual experience. So we got to do the best that we can. Now, burn it to the ground and start from scratch. Maybe there's some stuff we can do there. But even things as simple, for example, some people call it alternative minimum grading, where instead of 0, you get 50 as the lowest score. Because just mathematically, the way we weight our scales is nonsense.
Yeah.
50 or below is an F, or roughly around that. Sometimes 60 or below is an F in different schools.
Right. So we don't even consider the fact that somebody knows 50% of the stuff that we've been trying to teach them. It's like, but you just failed.
Yeah. Well, and because an A, so I'm just using typical, different places do it differently, but an A is going to be a 90 to a 100, B 80 to 90, C 70 to 80, D 60 to 70, and F is anything below that. Means that zeros are significant outliers. What we're saying in that scale is the difference between an 88 and a 93, those 5 points is pretty notable, but the difference between a 59 and a 0, no. But we then calculate the grades mathematically, which means you could have all of your stuff up here, but 1 0 will disproportionately pull it in that direction.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Instead of if we just have the grading scale split up evenly around the whole thing. So there's things like that. Really, a lot of places are trying to eliminate or limit grading as much as possible. More common these days is people are doing things like splitting it into summative versus cumulative assessments. Or no, not summative versus cumulative. Summative versus, what's the other one in that? Anyway, that sometimes we're looking at like what's the total summation. Sometimes we're looking at what's the process. But ultimately it's this. If you were intending to teach somebody something, it makes no sense at all to grade their initial attempt highest. What does that incentivize for people? You look at our culture, look at yourselves, people who are here, and oh, wow, it seems like a lot of people are really anxious about getting something right the first time. They don't like the idea of trying and failing at a thing, even though the failure gives them information that they can build on. You can't write a novel perfectly the first time, and people get stuck. And we then, again, individualize it. We put it on the person and make it about psychology. You're a perfectionist. You're afraid of blah, blah, blah. Instead of recognizing that, no, we start teaching kids at a very young age that your first attempt at a thing is what matters. If you fail at it and then learn from that failure, good for you, but we don't care. We're not going to track it. We're not going to weight that or measure that in. There should be no such thing as grades that cannot be improved upon later. If we're going to use them, they should be used in a way that encourages what we're actually theoretically going for, which is learning. You got a bad grade? Cool. Let's learn what went wrong and try it again. That's what we should be rewarding. But instead, what we're incentivizing is go for broke, go big or go home, do it great or don't do it at all.
Yep. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's lots of like specific things we could talk about in there. As far as the ideal, that's all about community versus competition. That my ideal school is a community center. It's a place full of resources, both in terms of tools, but also people, knowledge, experts who can help with the learning, that it doesn't have structured times where everybody has to be there. Honestly, in a lot of ways, it looks more like a college. Some people are better suited to working later. Some people are better suited to working earlier. That can depend on the person and their biology and their habits. It can depend on their parents' work schedules. It can depend on all kinds of things. But the more options we give people, the more support. Montessori is much more in this direction as well, where it's about supporting people in exploring things for themselves.
Yes.
The best learning happens through play. Play requires safety. The point of play is I can mess around without having to worry too much about what I'm doing because there aren't really any big consequences doing well or poorly or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I'm rambling.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
Just depends on what the goal is. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of interested in switching gears for our last, 18 minutes.
You want to go back to some of the open questions, or is there something else we want to go to?
What were the open questions? Good job tracking them.
The first one that I feel like we didn't really resolve, I talked a decent amount about coaching, but not so much about therapy. Then you asked about metrics, and I started talking about metrics and why they're problematic, but never actually answered how we know that this works, or at least what we're observing to see whether it works or not. And then we started getting into the education stuff because the metrics led us to grades.
Yes. I would like to touch on the therapy aspect of it.
Yeah. So therapy, for us, executive functioning coaching is a subset of therapy, meaning anything that an executive functioning coach can do, a therapist can do. But the reverse is not also true. There are things that therapists can do that coaches cannot do. In particular, and by far the most important part of any therapeutic process, I don't care what theory or approach people are using, is safety. That's why it matters to me so much that we do have some method of tracking and, what's the word I'm looking for? The point of licensure and all those things is credibility, right? It's that you, person who is looking for support, don't know any of these people individually, so you've got to look at markers that imply that they're credible. Mm-hmm. Does someone being a licensed therapist mean that they are going to be able to help you? No, but it's a safer bet than somebody who isn't. In fact, licensed therapists harm people all the time, but it's a safer bet theoretically. That's the idea behind it. So in particular, the fact that there are ethical guidelines and standards, and that there are boards, and that people can be reported to be held accountable for things, I think matters a lot in therapy. But anyway, the goal of therapy is safety. The therapist is trained to create an environment in which there are, theoretically, the goal is that there are not only no negative consequences for anything you say or do, but not even the worry or the perception that there might be any negative consequences for anything that you say or do. We call it unconditional positive regard. And that's often misinterpreted to mean I will think well of you or positively of you no matter what you do or say, which isn't the case. It is instead the case that if you say something that I don't like or that I would judge to be negative in some way, rather than cutting it off right there and saying, I have now defined what you've said and whatever, then I'm going to assume there's more to the story and I'm going to keep asking. I'm not going to run away. So that's not the case in coaching. It is a more specific process, and even trained and experienced therapists don't always do it well. But that's in particular the reason that for us, and if you're looking at coaching of any kind, I would highly recommend that you look into this particular aspect of whatever coaches you're considering working with. There are things that we consider to be off limits for coaches. Not a ton, but anything that has the potential for harm, if it's not handled appropriately, if the container of that session is not constructed well and closed off well and people aren't taken care of. So for example, we're not going to talk about trauma in executive functioning coaching. We're not going to talk about psychotic symptoms in we're not going to talk about suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation. We're not going to talk about anything where we have reason to believe that if it's not handled appropriately, the client could leave in a worse state than where they arrived. If a coach doesn't clarify to somebody that some things are off limits, I don't know each individual, and I can't say definitively that that's a bad thing, but it's something that I would want to know about. What is it that makes them confident? Because even if a therapist isn't confident that they can handle it well, they're still able to be held accountable if they don't. You can report them to their licensing board. A coach, not so much.
That's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's part of it, is we can go different places because it's about safety. The other part of it is that, therapists often will do a lot more of that inductive reasoning. And that depends a lot on the theory and the approach that a particular therapist is working with. But that's where we can say, we've noticed this happened and this happened and this happened. That seems like a pattern. Let's explore that pattern. It seems like it might suggest or imply that you think this or feel this or operate in this way or respond to these things in that way, as opposed to getting always just more specific. Therapists can get more specific. And when I say a therapist can do anything an executive functioning coach can do, I mean a therapist like ours that are trained in executive functioning and understand it. Most don't, which isn't to their detriment. It's just not a thing that they do. They do other things instead. Does that answer it?
Excellent. It does. I'm still going to make you create an elevator pitch someday.
Some people learn to be concise. Some people learn to be compelling so that I can take my time and you'll just listen.
Yes.
No, I'll work. That's the thing. The whole point of all of this is that it's about complexity. And so it's hard to distill that into something so simple. In particular, when I see elevator pitches, in writing, the first rule that people will say is show, don't tell, right?
Yes.
But when it comes to elevator pitches, you don't have time to show. You don't have time to explain how you do what you do. So the focus all becomes then on, here's what I can do for you, not how. And then therefore the value of it is saying, you want this thing, right? I can do it for you. And then appealing to credibility. Look at this person who's famous and is on our board, or, look at this license, or look at these results we've had with other people, as opposed to just saying, here's what I do, so that you can see it and you can make a determination about whether that seems interesting to you, instead of me having to appeal to, because all of those other things are fallacies, logical fallacies. The appeal to authority fallacy, for example. Oh, we use blank blank's model because they're an authority figure. It's supposed to be better. Yeah. And there's reasons for those, there's correlations and whatever, but I don't like it when people just make promises without explaining anything about how they think they can do that. When they say, come to us and things will get better. To me, explicitly, a big part of what we're doing is we, the practitioners, have to acknowledge that we don't know what's going to happen. Because one of the underlying premises that causes problems for, I would say, everybody, but maybe not everybody, is the idea that the difference between struggle or suffering and contentment is some skill, some knowledge. That the reason I'm suffering is because I am deficient. There's something I don't know how to do, something I don't understand, something I lack.
Right.
And so in that model, then that deficit model, if I go to a practitioner, the idea is that they do know whatever it is that I'm missing and that they can teach it to me so that they enable me to be able to do what I'm supposed to be doing. But here's the thing is that reinforces the premise.
Yeah.
If you come to me and say, I'm struggling with this, and I say, great, do this thing, then maybe you do it and it works. In which case, I've reinforced the idea that the only reason you were ever suffering at all is because you lacked something, that if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't have been suffering in the first place. Or you go and try and do it and it doesn't work, in which case now can go different ways, but some of the most common ways are, well, you can't help me anymore either, and I lose faith in practitioners generally, or very commonly lose faith in the idea that there's even anybody out there who could understand or help me in any way at all, if even the professionals can't. Maybe that also gets translated into, wow, even the people who specialize in my particular screwed up way of being don't help me. So I must be even more screwed up than the other people who are screwed up in this way. Even ADHD advice doesn't work for me. Oh man, I'm worse than other ADHDers. So we have to acknowledge that we don't know, that what we're doing is we're bringing our experience and our knowledge, and in community with each other, in relationship with each other, we're trying to answer the question of what's worth trying and then see what happens. Because of course we want to provide support and information. It's not to say you don't ever try to help anyone. It's the way you avoid reinforcing those premises and giving those messages is to be authentic and to say, I don't know either, but here's what I do know. And that might help us come up with something. And then we'll try it and see what happens. And a lot of times, honestly, stuff will work for a long time and then it stops working.
Yeah. In fact, I was just thinking earlier today about, my wife has ADHD, definite executive functioning struggles. And one of the things that we call me her accommodations, because I will regularly try to provide some executive functioning assistance. And I find quite regularly that, she'll come to me and she'll say, oh my gosh, I tried this thing and it's really helping. And then a week later, I ask her about that thing and it's just gone out the window. And sometimes it's just a matter of forgetting that she had that tool. And sometimes it's just like, on that day, that thing is not going to work. And that's hard. That's hard. That's a really hard world to live in, where you need so many tools, where you might, uh, need to shift on a daily basis. But I also, recognize that it's deeper than just having, like you said, the to-do list, the planner, the individual tools. I know, what's the cost to her? What's the value? Like, anyway, all of these things I'm trying to learn from you. But I had a question in there.
When I'm guessing, but just trying to help, it sounds like you're asking about when something works and then stops working.
Yeah, I don't know if I can really clarify the question, but right, as a care caregiver for children, or as a partner who's just regularly trying to assist their partner's life help it function a little better. Um, yeah, when something that has worked in the past stops working, or you think it should continue to work for that person, how do you transition? Or I guess this is a much bigger conversation than for the next 6 minutes, but
I mean, sure, but it's a fun challenge to say what I can say that might be helpful.
all right, you have 6 minutes.
Because we won't talk about like the should in there, right? Something that
Right.
seems like it should work, which is important.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, all that stuff, any strategy, any system, any whatever that helps with the kinds of things we're talking about, we call that stuff executive functioning now because that's, language is a living thing and it changes. But technically, that's not executive functioning. What we would call that is offloading. It's environmental things which offload some responsibility that executive functioning would have had to be taken care of onto something that exists in the environment, whether that's to-do lists or whatever. But here's the thing. The most important offloading in your wife's life is you. You said it yourself. You're saying it jokingly. We call you her accommodations, right? But again, that's how it's meant to work. That's why humans are social creatures. That's why we have relationships. We specialize. Communication enables us to come up with collective goals and then assign responsibilities towards those goals to individuals. And if you do this piece, I don't have to. And if I do this piece, you don't have to. There's a particular thing that's called transactional memory, which refers to the memories that you store in other people. There are things that are important to my life that I would otherwise have to remember that I don't, because I know that Susan remembers. And is also true vice versa. Right?
Like when the car bill is owed. Yeah. That makes sense.
It's one of the theories behind grief, that part of what grief is that you've lost access to those memories of yours that you stored in the other person. That there's stuff
that sounds very superficial.
It's not my favorite theory of grief, but I think it's relevant.
And it seems like a piece of it. It seems like
sure. Yeah. I mean, all of these are constructs and concepts. None of them, that's the whole point. We can't say X is Y when we're talking about this stuff,
Yeah.
Or X causes Y or whatever. Anyway, so why does a thing work? Actually, what we were just saying there, we generally collectively in this culture tend to overemphasize intellectual analysis. We think we can suss out cause and effect, which we can't. We can suss out relationships that guide us on what things seem worth trying next or what things seem worth doing differently, but we can't actually know why something works. And because the brain is a cognitive miser, as soon as we feel as though we have figured out why something is working the way that it is, we will not notice anything else about that process. In particular with your wife, it is quite likely that a lot of what is working or why something is working in any of those situations is because of novelty. Because what you're talking about is her attention, right? She and you are trying to manage and guide her attention to the right things, to the things that you have determined in the past you would want to be paying attention to in this moment. And novelty is a huge factor in that. A new system is novel. It draws the attention for that reason. At a certain point, when it becomes more routine, we stop thinking about it. And different people and different things, that happens in different ways. The point is not to figure out what element of it was novelty and what element of it was whatever else. The point is to stop thinking that moving on from it is a problem or a failure. I developed this system and it worked. Now I'm not using it, meaning it's no longer working. But I still believe that that's the system that theoretically works for me. So I'm not going to develop a new system. I'm going to try and get myself back to the old system, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. But instead of trying to figure out, well, why was it working and it's no longer working, we just say what is. It was working being defined as there was a particular thing I was trying to do or accomplish or experience, and that thing was happening. It was working, it's no longer working. Then it's no longer working. You can modify the existing one, or you can do what a lot of people do, like what you're talking about, modify other things around it so that I kind of try and switch things up in such a way that it starts to work again, even if that's just me trying to focus my attention on it more. Or you can just free yourself up from the idea that you're supposed to do it in any kind of a way, even if it's a way that's worked for you before, and instead just approach it as, what is the problem and what is the best solution I can come up with for that problem right now? Instead of, here's the solution that's worked for me in the past, how do I get back to it? You're muted if you're trying to say anything. It's a version of sunk cost fallacy, if that, anybody who knows sunk cost fallacy, that the idea that what happened in the past modifies what would be the optimal thing to do now. That because I've already sunk costs, I've sunk resources into this thing, it would be better for me to continue with that. So logically, the fallacy there is like, for example, If you're trying to solve some problem and it costs $5,000 and you're paying, saving up, and you've spent $4,000 towards it, and now all of a sudden a new solution becomes available that only costs $100, well, then you should switch to the new solution because it only costs $100 as opposed to the old solution, which will cost you an additional $1,000 on top of what you've already spent. But because I've already spent $4,000, I'm not switching to the new solution. I'm going to finish. I don't want to lose that $4,000. It's gone. It's already gone either way.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's part of the reason that you're her best accommodations, because no other thing in her environment is as perceptive or responsive or dynamic as you. You also are a living human being that observes the reality as it's changing and adapts and says things in response to what she's doing,
Right.
as some static physical thing. Which, by the way, she has plenty of routines, I'm sure. We all do. We have to. Finite resources. So there's lots of stuff that we do pretty much the same every day or week.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Not to overlook those. And yeah. And feel like you're constantly reinventing the wheel. Mm-hmm.
One way of dividing responsibilities and specializing in a relationship or community is by sussing out what things are most efficient for what people. That for me, it's, for example, easy to, I don't know, I was going to try and think of a real example, but now I'm having a hard time thinking of one. For me, it's easy to talk to my son about his interest in Minecraft every day, and so I do. And for someone else, it's easy for them to, I don't know why I'm trying to pick these kinds of examples. The point is that if you are it's for whatever reason, easy and efficient, you can turn eating into a routine. Meals at the same time and, the right kinds of things every day, and it doesn't take that much. For me to do that, it would take a lot more. So let's make that your responsibility. And then something else that we both want done where it's more efficient and I can turn it into like an automatic routine. Presentations, for example, I barely need to think about them. I barely need to think about it. Other people would have to spend a lot of resources to do the same thing. You and me as partners. I do this, you do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, we're over time.
We are. Thank you.
Thank you. This was fun. Thank you everybody who's here.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will be back next week, maybe with Zoe again at the same time, Wednesday 1, maybe not. We'll find out. Thanks for being here, and see you all later.
All right.